And it's with great pleasure that I welcome all of you. This is a capacity overflow crowd here in Harper 130 to this panel that will present, I think, a series of very interesting points of view about Professor Massey's topic, New Reality of Mexico-U.S. Migration. Just so that our speakers have an idea of who's in the audience, how many people here are students at the University of Chicago? All right, how many people here are faculty at the University of Chicago? How many people here are guests from the broader community? Okay, thank you. Our opening speaker tonight, Professor Douglas Massey, is well known to many people on this campus. He was professor of sociology and chair of Latin American studies for a while here. He was professor here for 7 years. He is one of, as you know because you're here, the most distinguished researchers on Mexico-U.S. migration, together with his partner from the University of Guadalajara, Jorge Duran. He has been running the Mexican Migration Project, which is one of the largest databases on migration from Mexico to the U.S., and it has been in operation for over 20 years. How many? 27?
Almost 30.
Almost 30 years. Doug has been president of the American Sociological Association, and he's recognized as a scholar not only for his work on Mexican migration, but also his work on racial segregation in urban areas in the United States. We're very pleased to welcome him back to the University of Chicago, and hope he decides he could come for a longer visit sometime. And then we will hear from our panel of commentators, who I will introduce as they are about to speak. So first, Professor Massey, thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come back to the University of Chicago. I taught here for 7 years, as you heard, and I still miss the place. I have very fond memories of both the city and the university. The build topic for tonight is the new reality of Mexico-U.S. migration. And from my point of view, the new reality is an immense war on immigrants that has evolved and escalated over the past several decades. And so what I want to talk about today are where this war on immigrants came from, why it emerged, and some of its causes and consequences. And if we have time at the end, I'm supposed to talk for 30 minutes. A little bit about possible solutions. So the whole problem really starts in 1965. 1965 is the key date because this is the year that amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act are passed. And it's also the year that the United States unilaterally terminated a long-standing guest worker program known as the Bracero program. The termination of the Bracero program and the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the amendments had little effect on the number of immigrants from Mexico, but it had a huge effect on the composition of the flow. And basically, these two acts were instrumental in shifting the majority of migrants from documented legal statuses to undocumented illegal statuses, even though the size of the flow didn't change very much. The obvious effect of the unilateral termination of the Bracero program is that you went from, in the late 1950s, a guest worker program that annually brought in 450,000 Mexican workers into the U.S. to zero. The amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act, you often hear it said that, oh, the 1965 amendments were important in transforming U.S. immigration from European origins to Latin American and Asian origins. Well, the Asian part is true, but it's not true about the Latin American part. Because, in fact, the 1965 amendments imposed the first ever numerical limitations on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Prior to 1965, there were no numerical quotas, no numerical limits on the number of people who could enter from Mexico or any other country in the Western Hemisphere. In 1965, a hemispheric cap of 120,000 people was placed on immigration from the Americas, and by 1976, every country had been capped at 20,000 visas per year. So from the late 1950s to the late 1970s, you went from a situation where you're bringing in around 500,000 workers per year, 450,000 guest workers, about 50,000 permanent resident visas, to a situation where there are no guest worker visas and only 20,000 visas capped for Mexico. And this is the result. This is what happened. We have migration from Mexico to the United States in 3 statuses. The green line is guest worker migration, temporary labor migration. The blue line is documented migration, and the red line is undocumented migration. The green lines and the blue lines come from official immigration statistics from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The red line, the estimated net flow of undocumented migrants to the United States, is based on estimates that I derived using information from the Mexican Migration Project and applied to Mexican census data. So basically what you see is in the late 50s, we had this massive inflow of migrant workers from Mexico, virtually all in some kind of legal status. Then in 1965, avenues for entry are closed off. In 1976, they are really closed off because the hemispheric cap is supplemented by a nation cap. And basically, you have a reverse image of the growth of migration under legal auspices, and then you have the undocumented migrants coming in, the red line peaking in around 1990, stabilizing, and then plummeting after 2011. I'll talk more about this graph later on. But what I want to make the point here is that we were importing about 500,000 Mexican workers per year in the late 1950s. We're importing about 500,000 workers in the early to mid 1990s. Nothing changed except the legal status into which these people were entering. This second root of the war in immigrants comes from the U.S. military intervention in Central America during the 80s, which led to a surge of refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Nicaraguans had the great good luck of fleeing a left-wing government, and therefore were given red carpet treatment in the United States and allowed to adjust status and become legal permanent residents under easy terms. The others had the misfortune of fleeing repressive right-wing governments who were erstwhile allies of the United States, and so by definition they could not possibly be refugees, and they were admitted grudgingly, if at all. Some got legal status, most were admitted under temporary protected status. In the case of El Salvador, most came without documents and never achieved any kind of legal status in the United States. To show you the effect of U.S. intervention, this is a very hokey index of the intensity of the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua, in Central America. And what we did was do a LexisNexis news search of mentions of Contra, killing, war. Basically, it's a frequency with which news stories covered the Contra intervention. So you can see it, and it peaks in around 1988. And these things, these various points actually correspond to real dates in real time. Now, this is just a hokey count of mentions in the news media, in the American news media, as a measure of the intensity of the U.S. involvement. And I didn't expect to have a marked correlation with migration flows out of Nicaragua, but this is what the data looks like. The red lines there, that is the official immigration statistics of the United States. And you can see that it virtually mirrors the flow, the intensity of the U.S. involvement as measured by our dubious index. Nonetheless, I think it's beyond coincidence that they parallel each other so closely. And of course, these are the official statistics are when people are admitted to permanent resident status. Nicaraguans were basically allowed to come in, many of them without documents and overstaying their tourist visas. Others came in under a temporary protected status, and when you pick them up, it's 2 years later when they adjust to permanent resident status under the NACARA legislation. From the Latin American Migration Project, we can actually measure the time they left, and this is from our Latin American Migration Project data, which is charting the year of departure, not the year of admission and permanent resident status. And so that goes right on top of the intensity of involvement. So basically, U.S. does two things. It basically starts a flow of migrants from Mexico that had been stopped dead by the Depression through a guest worker program, and this enabled a growing flow of people through the legal channels for permanent residents, and then cut those off in 1965, which spawned, the migration simply continued under other auspices and switched it from legal to illegal. At the same time, in the 1980s, the United States intervenes in Central America, and because of the hemispheric cap policies, the people that are pushed out of Central America by the U.S. Intervention have nowhere to go in legal status in the United States, with the exception of Nicaraguans, and end up in illegal status. So this is the top 5 sources of undocumented migrants. As you can see, Mexico dwarfs everything else. The other top 5 are Mexico, Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and our former colony, the Philippines. So this is really about U.S. policy and about U.S. interventions, going clear back to 1898 when we blew up the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila to colonize the Philippines. The consequences of that are still occurring. This is what the composition of the undocumented population looks like. It's about 3/4 Mexican and Central American. No other single country accounts for more than 2% of undocumented migrants. So basically, we're talking about Mexico and Central America, and everything else is pocket change. Now, the shift of Latin American immigration from legal to undocumented auspices created a real opportunity for political entrepreneurs in the United States. The rise of unauthorized migration enabled these people to frame immigration and immigrants from Latin America as illegal, by definition. And if they're illegal, then they're threats. They're subversive, they're criminals, they're terrorists, they're invaders, occupiers, and 2 metaphors came to dominate public discussion. The flood, where the U.S. is being flooded, and its culture, and we're drowning in a sea of brown faces, and the invasion, where we have aliens invading the United States. The border becomes a symbolic line separating us from them. Leo Chavez, an anthropologist at the University of California, Irvine, categorized U.S. magazine covers from 1965 to 2000, whether any cover that dealt in any way with immigration was coded, whether it was affirmative, alarmist, or neutral. As you can see, about 3/4 of the covers are alarmist. You might think, oh, well, 19 are affirmative. It turns out that virtually all the 19% of covers that are affirmative are around the 4th of July, when magazines routinely celebrate the United States as a nation of immigrants. And you can see that there's an increasing frequency of threat metaphors over time by decade. And as I said, the texts that corresponded to these magazine covers uses 2 metaphors. The marine metaphor, where immigration is a tidal wave flooding the United States and inundating its culture, or the martial metaphors, where the border is a battleground that's under attack from alien invaders. Border Patrol officers are outgunned defenders trying to hold the line against hordes. And you think, I'm making this hold the line stuff up. That is the official name of a border policy, Operation Hold the Line in El Paso. And aliens then become a time bomb waiting to explode and destroy American culture and values. And over time, we observe a gradual shift from marine to martial metaphors. President Reagan played a big role in making this shift prominent in American public airways. He was the first president to call illegal migration label illegal migration an issue of national security. And in a speech, he said, terrorists and subversives are just 2 days driving time from the border crossing at Harlingen, Texas. Immigrants constitute a 5th column because communist agents will feed on the anger and frustration of recent Central Americans and South Americans who will not realize their version of the American dream. This is in the height of the Cold War, the escalation of the Cold War. And if you want to get a sense for the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, I suggest you go out tonight and rent Red Dawn. And watch it. If you think I'm making this stuff up, watch Red Dawn. The war trope, the war metaphors are now the standard trope that are used to describe Mexican immigrations. Lou Dobbs is unapologetic. He says the invasion of illegal aliens is part of a war on the middle class. Patrick Buchanan, refers to an Aztlan plot, which, of course, my Mexican friends here know because they're all in on it. Aztlan plot was hatched by Mexicans seeking to recapture lands lost in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You probably got a secret handshake, too. and this is what Patrick Buchanan had to say. If we do not get control of our borders and stop this greatest invasion in U.S. history, not, greatest invasion in U.S. history, I see the dissolution of the U.S., the loss of the American Southwest, culturally and linguistically, if not politically, to Mexico. Samuel P. Huntington, just to add a veneer of academic respectability to this. Professor Huntington from Harvard. Unlike past immigrant groups, Mexicans and other Latinos are not assimilated into the mainstream, forming instead their own political and linguistic enclaves from L.A. to Miami, and rejecting the Anglo-Protestant values that built the American dream. The United States ignores this challenge at its peril. Pretty strong stuff. And then for less respectable sources, there's the Minutemen Defense Corps, organized in 2004 by an Arizonan guy named Jim Gilchrist, to do the job the government won't do, defend the U.S. border. They deploy, as you know, volunteers to sit on lawn chairs with oxygen tanks and watch the border, and then phone the authorities when they see the threats coming across. The Minutemen quickly became a media sensation with thousands of articles published in 2005, 2006. And last time I checked the website, which was in December, the headline was "Illegal and Ready to Kill." And the American Daily, even less respectable than the Minutemen, War on Terror begins at the Mexico-U.S. border. War on Terror begins. It's time to recognize that America's war on terror is being fought in places other than Iraq and Afghanistan. Our most critical theater of war is being fought at the U.S.-Mexico and left-out border. Our enemies are unlawful migrants who willfully violate our borders and thumb their noses at U.S. immigration laws. This is the spirit of the times. And Renato Rosaldo, a noted anthropologist at Stanford, has noted that the U.S. border has become theater. And border theater has become social violence. Actual violence has become inseparable from symbolic ritual on the border, crossings, lines of defense, high-tech salience, and more. So, corresponding to the rhetorical war on immigrants that followed the shift of the migration flows from legal to illegal, and the labeling of illegal people as dangerous, and the labeling of people as illegal, we had, corresponding to the shift and these anti-immigrant propaganda campaigns, we get a legal war on immigrants, beginning in 1986 with IRCA, which criminalized undocumented hiring for the first time, began a militarization of the border, which accelerated in 93-94 with Operation Blockade in El Paso and Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego. Operation Blockade was later shifted to Operation Hold the Line after Mexican government protested. After all, this was at the inauguration of NAFTA, and we're blockading our new trading partner. So to assuage sensibilities, they changed it to Operation Hold the Line, which is so much better. 1990 Immigration Act sought to cap family immigration through kind of a left-handed maneuver. The 1996 Immigration Welfare Reform Acts banned legal immigrants from entitlements and raised the income thresholds for sponsoring the entry of relatives in an effort to further reduce the avenues of legal immigration. The 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, it doesn't say anything about immigration in the title, but it has a lot to do with immigration. It authorized expedited exclusion of legal immigrants if they'd ever broken the law. And they applied this ex post facto. So if you had broken the law before 1996, after 1996 you could be deported for that earlier violation. No matter what your current circumstances were, no matter what debt to society you paid, and no matter how good a citizen you were at that point. And this is particularly relevant to Mexicans because 2/3 of Mexicans entering legally into the United States have prior undocumented experience. And at least in theory, that puts them at risk of deportation should that experience ever come to the attention of immigration authorities. The 287G program authorized state and local enforcement agencies to arrest and detain undocumented migrants. And then the well-known USA Patriot Act authorized the deportation without hearing or any presentation of evidence of any alien, legal or illegal, that the Attorney General had reason to believe might commit, further, or facilitate acts of terrorism. All of these things undefined, basically giving the executive branch of government carte blanche to declare any non-citizen immediately arrestable and deportable. And just to show you that this is not all funny business, this is my, I recently did this analysis where I looked at leading U.S. newspapers, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, and looked and counted frequencies of mention of immigration as a crisis, flood, or invasion. And you can see that in 1965, there's nothing. There's no illegal migration. There's nothing like that. Then with every surge, we get a new anti-immigrant act being passed. So, with the legal foundations in place, the United States has been escalating in its actual physical prosecution of the war on immigrants. Massive expansion of the Border Patrol, huge increase in the volume of arrests at the border, rapid growth in the immigration detention system, and the spread of enforcement from the federal to the state and local levels. Just to show you what I'm talking about, these are indicators of immigration enforcement, where we're looking at Border Patrol budget, line watch hours, that's hours spent patrolling the border, and number of Border Patrol agents. To put them on the same scale, everything's divided by their number in 1986, when this shenanigans really started. And so you can see that since 1986, the Border Patrol budget has increased by a factor of 20. The number of line watch hours spent patrolling the border has increased by more than 7 times, and the number of absolute number of Border Patrol officers has increased by almost 5 times. So we have a massive increase in border enforcement. And this is reflected in apprehensions. Even in the late 60s, we had a relatively small number of apprehensions. They climbed steadily to peak in the late 1990s. They've come down, partly for reasons I'll discuss later, but we're still arresting around 1 million people per year at the border. What's really unprecedented in recent American history, really in all of American history, is the extent to which enforcement has spread from the border to the interior. This is the number of deportations from the U.S. interior by year in absolute numbers. And so you can see that from 1965 up to 1989, there's virtually no trend. The numbers are in the 10 to 20,000 range. Then in 1989, they start to tick up a bit when the 1996 effective death penalty and anti-terrorist legislation passes. There's a huge bump upward, and then when the USA Patriot Act passes, there's a massive increase in internal enforcement. We are now deporting more than 350,000 people per year. Even at the height of the deportation campaigns in the 1930s, when we rounded up, and the other time we rounded up and systematically deported Mexican citizens, we only deported 120,000 people per year at the max. So it's a record level of deportation annually. And there's been a huge expansion in the immigration detention system. The average number of people per day in detention went from about 6,200 in 1992 to 20,000 in 2000, and then 31,000 in 2008. We are funneling through the immigration detention system 350 to 400,000 people per year. And once you're in that system, you are lost. You have no right to counsel. You don't have a right to contact your family. Your family doesn't know where you are. There's no lawyers, and literally you die. You can easily die in that system. And the other part to realize about the system is about half of it is not even government. It's subcontracted to like Whack and Hut security in Blackwater. And so you die because of private negligence that's not even subject to government oversight. The other thing that's happened is the spread of anti-immigrant legislation to the state and local levels. Historically, immigration has always been considered a federal preserve. Since 2001, with all the hysteria surrounding the war on terror, we've had a switch of immigration enforcement from the federal to the state and local level. The blue line is the number of bills considered by state legislatures, and the red line is the number of bills enacted. So you can see they only began counting this in 2005. because nobody did anything before. And so since 2005, the number of bills considered has gone from 300 up to about 1,400 per year, and the number of bills passed steadily increases, and you may have just read about the one passed in Arizona, where if a woman who's a legal resident is carrying her undocumented mother to the doctor, she can be arrested as a felony for transporting and harboring illegal migrants. The other thing that's happened is the spread of 287G agreements, under which local law enforcement authorities agree to take part in the law enforcement of U.S. immigration laws, basically using their local jails as money-making operations, arresting illegal migrants, holding them, and getting a subvention from the federal government. The big guy doing it, the real entrepreneur, is Sheriff Arpaio, America's toughest sheriff. He routinely, in a routine of ritual humiliation, parades Latino men, arrested Latino men through the streets of downtown Phoenix wearing pink shirts and pink underwear, handcuffed and shackled. This is not about deterrence. This is not about anything to do with immigration enforcement. This is ritual humiliation for political gain. And not surprisingly, there's been a response. Hate crimes are way up. They had been falling up through 2001. After 2001, anti-Hispanic hate crimes began to skyrocket. And this is from a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times by Charles Blow. The number of militia groups and hate groups and patriot groups has skyrocketed. And I expect to find more violence in the near future. Running out of time, so what has all this brought us? I got a lot more slides, and I can actually prove all the stuff I'm about to tell you, but just let me sum it up. Militarizing the border didn't solve the problem. Militarizing the border actually backfired, because by driving up the costs and risks of border crossing and dramatically increasing the death rate among border crossers, people minimized border crossing, logically enough. They did this by hunkering down and staying once they made it across. So the net effect of the militarization of the border was not to depress the rate of in-migration, but to dramatically reduce the rate of out-migration. And if you keep the rate of in-migration more or less the same and cut dramatically the out-migration rate, net migration increases. So the main effect of the militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border was to double the net rate of undocumented migration into the United States, while tripling the rate of death along the border. Initially, the border enforcement actions were concentrated in two corridors, San Diego and El Paso. A crossing point of 60 to 70% of all migrants in the United States. We militarized that and Chevy Blazers every 100 yards with 2 Border Patrol officers staring at this mess. Migrants got wise pretty quickly, and they started going across elsewhere, hence Sheriff Arpaio. They shifted from California, going through the Sonoran Desert, in through Arizona, and Arizona became the primary crossing point. And once they were diverted away from California, they just kept on going. And immigration within a decade was transformed from a regional phenomenon affecting 3 states into a national phenomenon affecting 50 states. Moreover, because the rate of out-migration had fallen, it shifted from a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a settled population of families living in 50 states. So basically, if you're worried about the costs of migrants to the United States, you've exacerbated and spread it all over the country. So the whole thing has backfired. And then finally, the criminalization of undocumented hiring in 1986 didn't stop undocumented hiring. It basically shifted the hiring process from direct hiring to indirect hiring. So before 1986, immigrants came up and employers hired them. And then afterwards, because employers were liable, they switched to subcontracting arrangements where immigrants would be forced to work through a subcontractor. And the net effect of this was not to reduce undocumented wages, which had always been low, but to eliminate the returns to legal status. It pushed down the wages of legal migrants and citizens working in these labor markets, because it doesn't matter if you're a citizen anymore. You still work through the labor contractor, and the labor contractor still exploits people like hell, and he doesn't care if you're a citizen or not. So basically, our attempt to have our cake and eat it too, to create an integrated North American economy that's free to the cross-border movement of goods, capital, information, services, and some kinds of people, but not free for the movement of labor, has all backfired. And we've ended up with more immigrants, spread more widely, in ever more costly ways, killing more and more people at the border, cutting Mexicans off from their homeland, reducing the flows of remittances back that assist Mexico, and all doing this at huge cost to the American taxpayer. So this is the background to immigration reform in the United States. Immigration reform is one of the key issues of the day. We need immigration reform because the lack of immigration reform is costing us money, getting us no security, undermining our long-term health and well-being as a nation. Immigration reform needs to be moved to the front and center of the agenda in the United States, needs to be made a part of a new civil rights movement in the United States.
I'm going to wear two hats because I'm going to introduce Governor Cardenas and translate for him. We're very honored and pleased to have Governor Lázaro Cárdenas Batel here with us at the university. His family, his father, Douglas Massey, is well known to us here at the UC, having been here at least twice in recent years as a visiting professor. And I know that the Center for Latin American Studies and the Friedrich Katz Mexican Studies program have a particularly close connection with the Cardenas family. Governor Cardenas is now a fellow at the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He was previously governor of the state of Michoacan, which is one of the largest populations in the Mexican community in Chicago are the Michoacanos. And he was governor from 2002 to 2008. During that period, he maintained a very close relationship with the expatriate community. It was under his leadership that the Michoacanos in Chicago were able to buy and open their really beautiful Casa Michoacan on Blue Island Avenue, which, if you haven't visited it, you should. It's a really wonderful structure, an important community center. And he was, before serving as governor of Michoacan, he was a senator in the Mexican Senate, and was the introducer of the initiative to allow Mexicans who became citizens of the United States to not lose their Mexican nationality. So in his career in politics in Mexico, he has always had his eye on what was going on this side of the border, and we're very pleased he can be with us here this evening.
Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias a Susan y muchas gracias a la universidad por esta invitación a hacer algunos comentarios relativos a la excelente presentación que acabamos de escuchar.
Thanks to Susan and the university for this invitation. Before I begin to respond to the very excellent presentation by Professor Massey.
Una presentación que da cuenta de manera muy clara de lo que ocurre con esta guerra sobre o contra los inmigrantes.
It's a presentation that gives us a very clear idea of what is happening with this war against migrants.
Con muy diversos y yo diría graves costos, y que ocurre además en momentos de crisis económica, de momentos en que este país está envuelto en dos guerras fuera de sus fronteras.
That has very diverse costs occurring at a moment of economic crisis when this country is involved in two wars outside of its own borders.
Y por supuesto de la elección reciente todavía de Barack Obama, el primer presidente afroamericano de los Estados Unidos, cosa que no podemos dejar fuera de este contexto de guerra contra los inmigrantes y de polarización, porque además hay que recordar que es hijo, el presidente es hijo de un inmigrante africano.
And this is also occurring very soon after relatively soon after the election of President Barack Obama, the first African-American president, which is something that is significant for this discussion because we can't forget that President Obama is himself the son of an immigrant from Africa.
Yo quisiera hacer unos comentarios desde la perspectiva de México y más específicamente de Michoacán, de un estado que tiene 4 millones de habitantes dentro de sus fronteras y entre 2,5 millones, 3 millones, las cifras no son precisas, de gente nacida en Michoacán o con orígenes en Michoacán viviendo aquí en los Estados Unidos.
So I'm bringing you these remarks not only from the perspective of Mexico, but also from the state of Michoacán, a state that has a population of 4 million people within its borders, and outside of its borders, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, the figures are not exact, who are either born in Michoacán or have roots in Michoacán.
Un estado donde las remesas que envían los migrantes son del mismo tamaño que el presupuesto público, que la totalidad del presupuesto público.
A state where the remittances sent by migrants are as great as the total public sector budget of the state.
Un estado que fue al mismo tiempo beneficiado y afectado por NAFTA, por el Tratado de Libre Comercio, es el mayor exportador de aguacate del mundo, principalmente hacia los Estados Unidos, pero tiene un sector agropecuario que al mismo tiempo se vio afectado, otro tipo de productores, por el tratado.
And it's a state which has had, and where NAFTA has had a great impact. First, it has helped Michoacán become the state which is the greatest exporter of avocados from Mexico, almost all of which come to the United States. But NAFTA also affected another sector of agriculture in Michoacán, producers of other products, in not a very beneficial way.
Las migraciones en el mundo a lo largo de la historia tienen una causa fundamental, y es la búsqueda de mejores condiciones de vida, por un lado, y por el otro, la demanda de trabajo que existe en ciertas partes, en los lugares de destino.
Migration really, all over the world, has the same causes. One is the search for a better life, and the other is the demand for work in certain areas of the world where people migrate to.
Esto es
Demand for labor, I'm sorry.
Esto es particularmente claro en los Estados Unidos, un país de migrantes por excelencia. Esto vale desde los colonos británicos que llegaron aquí hasta las más recientes migraciones provenientes de México, de Centroamérica, de Filipinas, sin dejar de lado a la migración forzada de africanos que vinieron a trabajar como esclavos a los Estados Unidos.
The United States is the premier country of migration from the British colonists up to the most recent migrants from Mexico and Central America, and this is not to leave on the side or forget about the forced migration of millions of Africans who were brought here to work as slaves.
Un motor fundamental o un elemento que es un incentivo muy poderoso a la migración es la vecindad entre dos regiones con desarrollos diferentes.
One further spur to migration is the nearness of two regions with such different patterns of development.
No es casual que el mayor flujo de personas entre dos países distintos en el mundo sea el que existe entre México y Estados Unidos.
It's not coincidental that the largest flow of people from one country to another in the world is that between Mexico and the United States.
Es un flujo proporcional al tamaño o a la magnitud de la brecha de desarrollo y de ingreso que hay entre estos dos países que son además vecinos.
It's a measure of the gulf between the levels of development in these two neighboring countries.
Si la gente se mueve entre Nigeria y Londres o entre Ecuador y España, pues sería inexplicable que no lo hiciera entre México y los Estados Unidos o entre Centroamérica y México y los propios Estados Unidos.
For sure, if people are moving from Nigeria to London, from Ecuador to Spain, of course it would be understandable that people would move from Mexico to the United States or from Central America to the United States. El
aporte de los migrantes mexicanos al desarrollo de diversas actividades económicas en los Estados Unidos, diversas regiones de los Estados Unidos, es muy claro.
The support that Mexican migrants have given through diverse sectors for the development of diverse sectors of the American economy and across regions of the United States is something that is very notable.
Igualmente claro es el aporte que estos migrantes hacen desde aquí al desarrollo de sus comunidades de origen en México.
And the other thing to note is the support that those same migrants give to the development of their communities in Mexico.
Sin embargo, ninguno de los dos países, ni México ni los Estados Unidos, han reconocido a cabalidad, me refiero a los gobiernos y a la propia sociedad, el aporte de los migrantes, ni tampoco han abordado al fenómeno migratorio en su integralidad.
Neither country, and I'm talking about the governments, has really recognized the contribution of these migrants, nor included it.
Que no han visto la migración, el fenómeno migratorio en su justa dimensión.
They haven't really recognized the actual dimension and contribution of migration in the bilateral relationship.
En México, la migración sigue siendo vista por muchos, dentro y fuera del gobierno, como una válvula de escape, como una fuente de recursos frescos, frente a la incapacidad del propio país de generar empleos suficientes y mejor pagados.
In Mexico, migration keeps being seen both inside and outside of the government as an escape valve and as a source of fresh resources in order to make up for the general incapacity of the government to create sufficient jobs or well-paid jobs.
Y en los Estados Unidos, aunque muchos sectores de la economía dependen del trabajo migrante, la migración sigue siendo objeto de estigmatización. Los inmigrantes son presentados, como dejó muy claro la presentación que acabamos de ver, como una amenaza a la seguridad del país, como una amenaza a los valores tradicionales de este país.
And even though migrants are making important contributions, that there are many segments of the economy that depend on them, they are still being characterized, as was so clearly stated in the prior presentation, as being a threat.
En el caso especial de México, en el caso particular de México, esta amenaza se ve todavía mayor por el hecho de que compartimos una frontera de miles de kilómetros, por la magnitud de la comunidad mexicana que vive en Estados Unidos, que asciende a muchos millones de personas, y por una relación entre los dos países pues, que ha tenido episodios de guerra, donde parte del territorio mexicano fue ocupado. En fin, hay una serie de hechos históricos que hacen que en el caso de México esa amenaza sea vista todavía como algo mayor que la migración proveniente de otras partes.
The question is whether, Mexico really has been such a threat. Mexico and the United States share a border of several thousand kilometers. Of course, there has been a war between Mexico and the United States in which Mexico lost a great part of its territory.
Y el tamaño de la comunidad mexicana.
Oh, and the size of the Mexican community is really, measures in the millions of people. That is a community which goes between those two countries.
El profesor Massey lo decía muy claramente, la migración de México y de Centroamérica es por mucho la migración a la que todos estos promotores de la guerra se refieren principalmente.
Yeah, and it's really Mexican and Central American migration that those people who are the promoters of this image of a war are focusing on.
El enfoque principal sobre la migración es el de la seguridad, incluso entre aquellas personas que no son parte activa ni promotores de esta guerra. En la esfera de las políticas públicas, en las discusiones en el Congreso, sigue siendo fundamentalmente el tema de seguridad el que prevalece cuando se habla de migración.
Security is the theme that dominates the discussion of migration in various spheres of the government, not only among those people who are promoters of this notion of immigration consisting of a war, but generally in many discussions of immigration in all different kinds of public policy circles.
En un segundo término bastante lejano estaría el enfoque económico y totalmente ausente el enfoque que ve a la migración como algo que no se puede separar del desarrollo y que no se puede separar del concepto de los derechos humanos.
It's interesting that in a focus which really has to look at the economy, that migration has not been analyzed as part of something that contributes to the economy, and has not been looked at as having anything to do with universal human rights. That kind of discussion is almost totally absent from the discussion of migration.
Es muy frecuente escuchar voces mexicanas, tanto del gobierno como desde la sociedad, que reclaman respeto a los derechos humanos de los migrantes en los Estados Unidos.
It's very common to hear voices from Mexico, voices from the Mexican government, that demand that the rights of Mexicans in the United States be respected.
Esas voces generalmente tienen razón, esos reclamos se hacen con razón.
These voices are right, these are just demands that they're making.
Sin embargo, hay que hacerse otra pregunta.
But however, you have to ask another question.
¿No constituyen también una violación a los derechos humanos la falta de acceso a la salud, la ausencia de empleos, de satisfactores básicos, de oportunidades de desarrollo?
You have to ask, isn't it also a violation of human rights? The lack of access to education, the lack of access to health care, the lack of access to decent jobs.
Nuestras naciones, desde mi punto de vista, necesitan y están obligadas a garantizar que las personas y las comunidades puedan ejercer estos derechos básicos.
I think it's the obligation of our governments to make sure that our people can exercise those basic human rights.
Y también el derecho a no migrar, que la gente, si emigra, lo haga como un acto de libertad, pero no porque una situación como la que mucha gente vive en México o en Latinoamérica los obliga a buscar futuro en otras partes.
And we also have to talk about a right to not migrate, that the act of migration should not be something that is forced by the conditions that people need in order to satisfy basic needs, and that they are forced to leave their countries in order to satisfy them.
En estos momentos muy difíciles, por cierto, se discute la necesidad de una reforma migratoria en los Estados Unidos.
Certainly right now we're talking about the necessity for an immigration reform in the United States.
Mucha gente lucha porque esta reforma se haga realidad. Aquí está uno de los principales impulsores de esa lucha con nosotros.
A lot of people are fighting to get this reform, and here we have one of the principal fighters for that reform, Artemio.
Sin duda, creo yo que hay que apoyar esta lucha.
Doubtless we have to support this fight.
Pero creo yo que si una reforma migratoria en los Estados Unidos no prevé los flujos futuros, como bien lo plantea el profesor, y sobre todo si deja de lado la perspectiva de desarrollo íntimamente ligado a la migración, pues va a ser sin duda una reforma incompleta.
And if that reform doesn't include some understanding of how to deal with future flows, some inclusion of what happens with development policy, then it's just going to be an incomplete reform.
Si estos elementos no se toman en cuenta, es totalmente seguro que dentro de 5 o de 7 años nuevamente se esté discutiendo en los Estados Unidos la necesidad de una reforma que regularice la situación migratoria de los nuevos 4, 5 o 7 millones de inmigrantes que van a llegar de todas maneras.
If this reform doesn't take into account those elements of development, then we're going to see a situation in which 5 to 7 years from now, there's going to be another legislative initiative which is going to have to talk about the regularization of the status of the 4, 5, or 6 million undocumented who are going to be here.
Hay que recordar las medidas que se tomaron en la época del presidente Ronald Reagan,
We have to think about the measures taken during Ronald Reagan's administration.
Que beneficiaron sin duda a muchas familias,
That benefited a lot of families.
pero que evidentemente no fueron al fondo del asunto, y tan es así que hoy nuevamente se está discutiendo la necesidad de medidas para regularizar la situación de millones de personas.
They didn't really reach to the source of the phenomenon, and so that's why we're here today talking about the possibility of regularizing the status of millions of people.
Y finalmente solo quiero felicitar al profesor por esta exposición.
And I'd like to congratulate the professor for his presentation.
Agradecer nuevamente la invitación a conversar y a hacer algunos comentarios aquí con ustedes.
And again for the and I'm pleased with the invitation to be able to talk to and have a conversation with you.
Muchas gracias.
It is now my great privilege to present an old friend of mine, Artemio Arreola. We've known each other since the mid-1990s, when he was one of the leaders of the emerging organization of the Federation of Michoacan Clubs in Chicago. People from various small towns in the state of Michoacan and Chicago had banded together and developed projects which they would, when Governor Cardenas was here, present to the governor to discuss with him around a big table in Casa Michoacan. And Artemio was one of the leaders of this group, which really had a transnational perspective on the role of Mexican immigrants in development in both countries. At that time, he was working as a custodian in a school. He then, because of his obvious talents as an organizer, was taken up as an organizer by the Service Employees International Union. He's one of the principal people, I'm saying this, he wouldn't boast about it himself, responsible for the 2006 marches in Chicago that brought close to 1 million immigrants and their supporters to the streets. He's the person who sat down with the head of the Chicago Federation of Labor and said, you don't have to be afraid to march on May 1st. They're not going to call you communists. And Tom Balinoff said to him, we'll do it if you can bring enough people. Can you bring enough people? And Artemio said yes, and there were 750,000 to 1 million people in the street in Chicago. Again, recognizing his obvious talents as an organizer, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, say those años, ¿cuántos?
¿Qué pasó?
Que llegaste a ICER.
I said 2 years later,
Yeah,
a little more than 2 years.
Josh Hoyt, the president of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, hired Artemio as his political director. Anybody who can get close to 1 million people in the streets clearly knows something about organizing. So we're very pleased to welcome him, and even though he speaks both English and Spanish, I think we'll get more punch if we have him in Spanish, so I'm going to translate for him. So welcome.
Okay, thank you. As I work in an ICER, they force me more to speak English.
It's true. Wait, I have to tell one other story. About a year and a half ago, Professor Friedrich Katz from Mexican Studies became a citizen of the United States. And I was honored to be, Friedrich invited me to come with to his naturalization ceremony. And after Friedrich took the oath to become a citizen of the U.S., and the Immigration Service had invited him to speak to the other new citizens because they realized he was a historian of some importance, Artemio is the person who registered Friedrich Katz to vote.
And this is a big secret. I can keep it. I cannot keep it here. I put in the media, put in the newspaper, everywhere, something to be proud. Cuando vi la presentación, empezamos en el 65.
When we saw the presentation, we started in 1965.
Yo nací en 1965.
That's when I was born.
Y me acuerdo que mi padre venía a los Estados Unidos cuando él era soltero.
And I remember that my father came to the U.S. when he was single.
Cuando yo era niño, jugaba también a que cuando fuera grande iba a venir a los Estados Unidos.
When I was little, I used to play that when I would grow up, I would go to the United States.
Jugaba con hojas, que era el billete verde.
I played with leaves, that those were the green bills that I was going to have.
Y lo menciono esto porque es esa una realidad en nuestros pueblos, ¿verdad?
I'm mentioning this because this is a reality in our towns.
Pero uno aprende de chico también a querer a su patria, ¿verdad?, como a querer a este país.
And one learns when you're a kid also to love your country, as you know, people love this country.
Yo llegué a este país en el 89.
I came here in 1989.
A los primeros años de llegar aquí me empecé a dar cuenta en una fábrica que yo trabajaba, la vida que vivían los trabajadores migrantes ahí.
You know, and I sort of started figuring out in the first years that I was here in the factory that I was working in, what the life was like of the migrants who were working with me.
Y me di cuenta que la presentación que acabamos de ver es una realidad que no es lo que nosotros, los trabajadores migrantes, somos para la sociedad.
And, you know, this presentation presents a view of reality that really isn't what we are for this society.
En mi análisis que yo pude hacer era que esto ocurre porque la comunidad mexicana no tiene poder.
In my analysis, this happens because the Mexican community doesn't have power.
Había grupos organizados que ya trabajaban para ratificar sus derechos políticos.
There are groups that were working to get their political rights recognized.
Nos organizamos con más y gracias a personas como Lázaro Cárdenas, que en aquel entonces estaba en la legislatura federal, se pudo introducir una iniciativa para la no pérdida de la nacionalidad mexicana si tú adoptabas la nacionalidad norteamericana.
And it was a real help to our organizing efforts that when Lázaro Cárdenas was in the Senate, that the Mexican Senate passed a law which meant that if a Mexican became an American citizen, they would not lose their Mexican nationality.
Y vi que iban a aplaudir, sí, por favor, sí. Menciono esto fuerte porque lo que a la presentación que vimos es no hay poder político, ¿verdad?
Because I'm saying this in a very strong way, because in the presentation we saw there isn't political power.
Ok, pues 96 al 2008 son 12 años. 12 años de que la comunidad mexicana puede hacerse ciudadano en Estados Unidos y no perder su nacionalidad en México. Es muy poco tiempo.
The 8 years between 1998 and 2006, the 12 years between 1996 and 2008, sorry, I can't do math and translate at the same time, was a period when Mexicans could naturalize to become U.S. citizens without losing their nationality in Mexico.
Okay. De ahí aquí, en el 2005, bueno, primero en el 96, que también se gana eso en México, se hace una gran pérdida en Estados Unidos. Nos la acaba de mencionar el profesor, ¿verdad?
So in 96, we won this initiative in Mexico, but we had a big loss here in the United States, as Professor Massey just explained.
Después, en el 2006, en el 2005, en diciembre 15, para amanecer el 16 del 2005, es pasada la ley más dracónica, mala, Sensenbrenner, en el Congreso de los Estados
So
Unidos.
December 15th of 2005, the United States Congress, the House, passed in la Cámara de Diputados,
En la Cámara, sí.
in the House of Representatives, passed one of the most draconian laws that had been passed in the U.S. Congress, the Sensenbrenner bill.
Nosotros las comunidades queríamos hacer cosas, ¿verdad? No podemos combatir contra el poder que no tenemos.
We wanted to do something in our communities, but we couldn't fight against a power we didn't have.
Convocamos a reuniones principalmente en Casa Michoacán y decidimos hacer algo. Les voy a poner como ejemplo.
We called a few meetings in Casa Michoacán, and we decided we should do something, and I'm going to give you an example.
Okay. Cuando un niño tiene hambre, ¿qué hace el niño?
When a child is hungry, what does a child do?
Cry, jumpen, and yelling, I want a milk, I want a milk, I want a milk. Okay.
En español.
Yo quiero leche, yo quiero leche, yo quiero. Okay. Bueno, es lo que la comunidad organizada hicimos, ¿verdad?
That's what we did as an organized community.
Nos organizamos, nos fuimos a la calle y fuimos a gritar, no soy criminal, no soy criminal, no soy criminal.
So we got organized, we went out in the streets, and we shouted, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a criminal.
Y se fue la voz a través de todo el país.
And this voice spread all over the country.
Ustedes recordarán, en el 2006 se detuvo la Sensenbrenner.
And so you remember in 2006, the Sensenbrenner bill was killed.
Y en el 2007 se introdujo otra, igual no tenemos poder político.
And in 2007, they introduced the same bill all over again. And this just shows we didn't have political power.
Okay. Pero también en el 2006 empezamos a gritar en las calles, hoy marchamos, mañana votamos.
But in 2006, we began to march in the streets with the slogan, today we're marching, tomorrow we're voting.
Muchas organizaciones, comunidades a través del país, desde entonces, hablamos que en el 96 se puede hacer, ¿verdad, ciudadano? Después, 2 años después, estamos promoviendo, principalmente en este grupo mayoritario, en los mexicanos, háganse ciudadanos.
So starting in 96, but then really seriously later, we started promoting among Mexicans, get citizenship.
¿Y qué es lo que acaba de pasar en las elecciones pasadas del 2008?
And what happened in the elections in 2008?
En números récords, los mexicanos, bueno, todos, ¿verdad? Pero los mexicanos salimos a votar.
And in record numbers, Mexicans came out to vote.
Y da crédito no solamente a los mexicanos, pero a los latinos. Los mexicanos somos la mayoría.
You have to give credit to all the Latinos. Mexicans are the majority, but it was Latinos.
Por lo menos 7 estados
At least 7 states
dieron la victoria a Obama.
gave the victory to Barack Obama.
Y salieron a votar, el tema era la reforma migratoria.
And the reason they came out to vote was because of the theme of immigration reform.
No quiero alargarme más, pero quiero decir,
I don't want to talk much more, but I want to tell you,
este año es un año crucial,
this is a crucial year.
es el censo.
This is the census.
Estamos trabajando en nuestras comunidades también para todos ser contados.
We're working in our communities that everybody should be counted.
No solamente porque creemos que haya más dinero en las comunidades,
It's not only because we think that there should be more funding coming into the communities,
porque viene la redistritación y queremos nuestro pedazo en el pastel.
But redistricting is coming and we want our piece of cake.
Queremos nuestras áreas, queremos estar ahí, ¿verdad?
We want our districts. We want to be there.
Entonces, quiero decir que la comunidad se está sofisticando, ya no nada más vamos a hacer grandes números de migrantes, sino se está transformando en poder político.
Now the community is sophisticated. From large numbers of immigrants, we want it to be transformed into real political power.
Solamente quiero decir que el mensaje que se vivió en el 2001, cuando la desgracia en Nueva York,
Well, I want to tell you something. The message that came out in 2001 during the tragedy in New York,
hasta el día de hoy, es totalmente lo opuesto, ¿verdad? Los migrantes no somos terroristas.
it really should be reversed by now. We migrants are not terrorists.
Ahora solamente falta que eso llegue al mensaje claro.
This has to become a very clear message.
Presentaciones como estas demuestran que hay mala intención detrás de la realidad.
Yeah, just presentations like this show that there are bad intentions behind some of the reality.
Solamente quiero darle las gracias
I want to thank you
y decirles una cosa.
and tell you one thing.
Ustedes escuchan muchas presentaciones.
You guys hear lots of presentations.
A lo mejor la que escucharon ayer les vinieron a decir que el NAFTA creó muchos trabajos
Maybe what you heard yesterday was that NAFTA created lots of jobs,
y que México es el mejor socio comercial de Estados Unidos,
that Mexico is the U.S.'s best trade partner,
¿no? Que nos traten como tal.
and they treat us like this. And she went on to get her PhD in sociology at Notre Dame, and she is now an assistant professor in Latin American Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She has had a very long history of working with Mexican immigrant communities in Chicago, particularly with the Michoacan Federation, whose work formed the basis for her dissertation project. And I know that, because I've known Xóchitl personally all this time, I know that she's done a lot of things with the Michoacan Federation. I remember one project when she was helping to prepare the candidates for the Miss Michoacan beauty contest by working with them to get them to do poetry recitation as part of the talent show that they were going to do at the annual meeting of the Michoacanos. So Xóchitl is a scholar who has a connection with the community. She herself is from the state of Veracruz, but she's really come to understand and work with Mexicans from all over Mexico who live and work in Chicago and the rest of the U.S. And now I can sit down and leave Professor Bada to speak to you.
Well, Good evening. I'm very happy to be here because it's been, as Susan said, 10 years since we met. And since everyone has been starting with these anecdotes, I really need to start by my own anecdote on how is it that I came hooked on the Federation of Michoacano Clubs in Illinois. And it was in the summer. Oh, okay, you cannot hear me? Oh, it's not working? Oh, okay. It was in the summer of 2000 when I came to work for Susan at the U.S.-Mexico Advocates Network that was then part of Harlem Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. Well, after I finished my master's degree at the New School for Social Research in New York, so I came here trying to look for a job because I had to pay my tuition for going to the MAPS program, as she said. And then she offered me a job, and then introduced me to the Federation of Michoacano Clubs back in 2000 when they had just been 3 years as a federation, formed as a federation. So I became totally fascinated by the work that they were doing. I used to be a volunteer for Tepeyac Association, for those of you who know Tepeyac in New York. It's a very different organization. It's a faith-based Guadalupano association that also fights for immigrant rights, but with a different perspective. So I started traveling to Michoacan constantly, first for my master's degree, then for my PhD. And I really became fascinated with this movement of the hometown associations. And I am happy that today some very important people who helped me 10 years ago to get started with this project are here. Victor Espinosa is now taking photographs. And for those of you who are interested in knowing more about Artemio's narrative about what happened in 2006 in the city of Chicago, I have a very quick announcement to make. You can order now the book Marcha, Latino Chicago and the Immigrant Rights Movement, edited by Amalia Payares and Nilda Flores Gonzalez by the University of Illinois Press. And there you will find many, many interesting narratives about what happened in 2006. From the early praise of the book, I'll read a quote by Professor Jonathan Fox, author of Accountability Politics, Power and Voice in Rural Mexico. And he says about the book, Marcha brings together a diverse array of complementary analysis of key actors, ideas, and institutions of the spring 2006 immigrant rights mobilization, the largest single wave of street protests in U.S. history. And we have among us the photographer for the book. Thank you, Victor, for giving us your art for the book. Okay, so Susan asked me to tell you what is the state of the Hometown Association projects that are still doing this, trying to do transnational development in rural Mexico. And that prompted me to start asking everyone, both at the government level, at the hometown club level, okay, do you think that your projects have been reduced because of the U.S. economic recession? And from anecdotal evidence from the hometown clubs that I am familiar with, Jalisco, Guerrero, Guanajuato, they said no, our projects have been kept very well at the same levels. They haven't decreased. In some cases, they have actually increased. So I went to the Ministry of Social Development and I asked them the same question, can you please share the numbers? And the numbers are surprisingly stable. There hasn't been any significant reduction, neither at the level of participation by the migrants themselves, nor at the level of the federal Mexican government budget that they have implemented. You might know that this is a very modest budget. It doesn't represent not even 1% of the total budget that Mexico gives to social development as a whole. So you need to understand that this 3-for-1 matching funds program, where the many hometown associations have benefited, has been mostly like I would say a token of appreciation sometimes that makes lots of difference in rural Mexico. But when you compute how much like the federal government is offering for these migrant clubs in the United States to bring development back, is not as enormous as you consider compared to the family remittances, the individual family remittances, which, by the way, since 2008 have been drastically reduced. But the communal remittances to Mexico seems to be in a pretty good shape. And so now you might ask me why that is happening. So there are several factors why they haven't been hardly hit in terms of how much they can keep development new projects. First of all is because there is like a lot of replenishment in the stock of the hometown clubs. They are always in constant motion. They are new clubs all the time. There are new clubs who are forming. They are networks who mature and who have been saving money for a long time, not for 2 or 3 years ago, but they have been saving up to the point that they have the first $10,000 that they need to start their first matching fund. So this is an important reason why they have not seen a decrease. So and the interesting part is that some of the older clubs, those who came of age 10 years ago, are not doing any more projects precisely because they are now more interested in civic engagement in the United States. So they are some sort of taking a break. They are now a lot more engaged in issues that matter the most to their new adopted communities, to their new places of residence. But since you have this constant migration that are still like, well, as Professor Massey was presenting, is very close to zero now in 2010, but you need to remember that in the last 10 years, you've had constant waves of new immigrants who go back. Some of them go back and forth, but others have stayed here for longer periods of time. So that's what it really helps the networks mature and start this phenomena of or trying to help your hometown or doing these practices of civic binationality. But they also tell me very, very interesting thing, that they have not been disturbed too much about their fundraising abilities. And some of my informants are here tonight, and I am very grateful for that you accepted to do a little bit of interviewing with me regarding this issue. And they tell me that their communities are based on a cash economy, that they don't use credit cards too much. So they constantly hear these horror stories of this mortgage crisis, or that people is losing their homes, or that people is drowning in debt. But it doesn't happen to the members or the leaders of the hometown clubs, because it happens that most of them, as you might well know if you are familiar with the literature on hometown clubs, that the leadership it's the middle class. And many of them happen to be businessmen themselves, and they really try to do savvy investments of their monies. And they relate to me that they know that most of the members who are pitching in like $10, $20, etc., are not used to having credit cards. So therefore, they have been a little bit spared from this crisis, and they have decided to weather the crisis here in the United States as opposed to go back to Mexico. And this is coincident with other research that has recently been collected by different teams. For instance, I can recall the recent book by Wayne Cornelius on the migration of indigenous Mayans from Yucatan, from the Yucatan Peninsula, that it also agrees with Doug Massey that there is like a kind of a break now. There are no more new migrants coming because of the price of the smugglers have gone up to the point that it is no more like the cost analysis doesn't match. It's not convenient for new migrants to pay too much money, because now you have at least a 2-week waiting time for finding a new job in the United States, whereas before, once you came, some job was already waiting for you. So now people think twice. So what is happening is that people is deciding to migrate internally instead. In the Yucatan Peninsula, they instead of coming to California, what they do is they go to Cancun for some sort of temporary job that has to do with the tourism industry. But since I know that you are very eager to talk to Professor Massey, the only thing I wanted to share with you about his presentation, he referred to this legislation about 2007, when there were lots of enactments of new immigrant related bills. And I am currently on a civic engagement project when we are trying to understand how context matters and how differences in communities and different contexts of reception make lots of differences in the way in which communities, the destinations, try to enact new laws in favor of immigrants. And we are about to publish the results, but among the key findings that we have that have a lot to do with the graph that Professor Massey presented, I want to share with you a more nuanced detail of those numbers that you saw. And this is just one paragraph, and I will finish there. And it says, unfortunately, the media have overlooked some of the proposals designed to promote immigrant integration. In an analysis of 1,059 immigration-related bills and resolutions introduced in state legislatures in 50 states in 2007, which is the year when you see this peak, when lots of bills get introduced, researchers found that legislations expanding immigrant rights were enacted at a higher rate, 19% of 313 bills, than policies contracting immigrant rights. 11% of 263 bills. In 2007, 1 year after the massive immigrant mobilizations of 2006, states with the largest foreign-born populations, such as California, New York, and Texas, were more likely to introduce legislation to expand immigrant rights, regulate human trafficking, and address integration policy and the provision of language access services than legislatures in new destination states, such as South Carolina and Nevada, where bills contracting immigrant rights were the most popular type of measure introduced. And so we have this project that includes 9 medium-sized cities, and we compared it with 2 global cities. And our original question was, what was the effect of the marches of 2006 in civic engagement and in immigrant integration? And we have found very interesting comparisons depending on several factors. But this I really wanted to show to you this nuance about when you go deep into understanding the type of legislations that are getting enacted. And I will end it here, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I know that you want to talk to our panel. Whoops.
I think what we'll do is take a couple of questions, like 2 or 3 questions, because I have, and then we'll ask the panel to answer them. So questions, people who want to. All right. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll get to you guys here. Go ahead. And identify yourself if you're a student of it.
My name is Nicholas. I'm actually from high school, from the Lions School of Chicago. This is something that I was interested in because I'm part of an independent study that's based off of Mexican immigration and sort of the culture-based aspects of it. And I want to ask the panel, what do you guys, a lot of the things that I've been looking at deals with the fact that upon arrival to the United States, many immigrants find it culture-wise, they tend to lose a lot of it, and especially as their children grow up, it more so they begin to become Americanized and lose some of those traditional aspects that make Mexican culture so unique. And so I would ask the panel, have you guys experienced that at all, and just comment on your assimilation into American culture.
Fred? Sal?
Fred Sau. I'm the writer here. I'm the policy director of the Urban Refugee Rights.
And alum of the college.
Co-worker of Artemio, protege of Susan, and admirer of Professor Massey. I wanted to get your thoughts on how to counteract, in particular, this rhetorical pattern that Professor Massey so well documents. How do we win back the rhetorical high ground?
Okay, we'll take one more question. There was somebody in the middle who had a question. Yeah.
I'm Francisco Arroyo. I'm here with Artemio. And my question, well, as well as Artemio, I agree that if we're going to exercise free trade, what difference does it make if they do it from Michoacan or they do it from Pilsen? Another note, what was done wrong during the Reagan administration that we are, again, requesting for another immigration reform, and what can be done to prevent from happening again?
Okay.
And I know that Mr. Lazaro made the point that it's a right to not feel like you have to migrate from the country. And that's one of the things that what can be done to prevent this situation from happening again.
So should we go this way, Doug, and then across?
Well, the first question was about immigrant assimilation, and I'm well assimilated, so maybe somebody else should answer that one.
Artemio?
Hay diferentes familias,
They're
¿verdad?
different families.
Pero te quiero decir que yo tengo mis sobrinos nacidos aquí.
But I have nieces and nephews born here.
Tú les preguntas, ¿de dónde eres?
And if you ask them where you're from,
México.
they say Mexico.
Ok. ¿De dónde naciste? En Chicago.
Where were you born? In Chicago.
Y cuando ellos llegan allá,
And when they go there,
les dicen que son gringos,
they say that people say that they are gringos.
porque no hablan el español, o hablan el español con acento.
They speak Spanish with an American accent.
Quiero decir este ejemplo porque hay una gran cantidad
I want to give you this example because there's a large number
y ahora más de niños que se están yendo para allá.
Of children who are going over to Mexico,
Y te tienen que asimilar también allá.
and they have to assimilate there too.
Así es que la sociedad en los dos países tiene que ser más abierta a ver que esta es una nueva era.
The society on both sides of the border has to be more open to the fact that this is a new era.
Nosotros aquí contribuimos de una manera. Tú hablabas de Pilsen.
We contribute here in a way. You talk about Pilsen,
Y Pilsen es un barrio que está también combinado, ¿verdad?
and it's a neighborhood that has a lot of that is combining a lot of different people.
Y hay generaciones de 4, 5, personas de 4 o 5 generaciones.
There are people in Pilsen who've been in the United States for 4 or 5 generations,
Y algunos sí ya no hablan español.
and a lot of them don't speak Spanish anymore.
Pero creo que es porque los años que les tocó vivir a ellos,
But during the period when they were growing up,
como vimos ahorita, era más todavía. Los padres decían, yo no quiero que mi hijo pase lo que yo pasé, ¿verdad?
their parents probably said something like, "I don't want my kid to have to go through what I did."
Pero creo que las últimas generaciones
But the more recent generations
quieren ser en los dos idiomas.
want to be able to participate in both languages.
Y esto no es propio a los mexicanos.
This isn't just the Mexicans.
Yo recuerdo que ahora en el 2008 corrimos una campaña de participación cívica y fue una gran campaña en Chinatown.
We did a big civic participation campaign in 2008 in Chinatown.
Y la hicimos trilingüe.
We did it as a trilingual
Fue
campaign.
en inglés, mandarín, en cantonés.
We had to do it trilingual, English, Cantonese, and Mandarin.
Y hubo más participación.
There was more participation.
La gente se sentía completamente identificada porque había una conexión directa.
People really identified with this campaign because they really felt like they could make a direct connection.
Hacia el norte hicimos otras publicaciones en coreano.
On the north side, we do a publication in Korean
También lo hicimos con los musulmanes,
with the Muslims, Hindus.
Quiero decir que esto es América.
That's America.
Ahí no.
Lázaro.
Sí, yo quisiera comentar algo relacionado con lo que dice Artemio.
I want to make a comment on what Artemio just said.
Por un lado, es necesario para integrarse al país, para participar, para ascender socialmente.
There's ways in which it's important to participate in the country, to be integrated, to ascend socially if you can.
Y bueno, y para ello es necesario hablar inglés, para ello es necesario adquirir aspectos de la cultura del país al que se llega.
For that, you have to be able to speak English and acquire some of the cultural traits that are part of the country.
Eso a veces implica la pérdida de valores culturales propios.
This can imply sometimes the loss of your own cultural values.
Pero yo creo que esa no ha sido la regla. Lo que yo he podido observar
That's not the rule. What I've seen
en el caso de la comunidad mexicana, michoacana y de otras comunidades en los Estados Unidos,
What I've seen in the case of the Michoacano community, in the Mexican community in the United States, other communities in the United States,
es que también hay una tendencia a la conservación de la cultura propia, a mantener la identidad propia.
there is a tendency to conserve your own culture, to maintain your own cultural identity.
Como una vía también para fortalecer y darle mayor cohesión a la comunidad.
To give more cohesion and fortify the community.
Y creo que esto tiene que ver, en el caso de México, con el hecho de que tenemos una comunidad binacional.
And this is, what's resulted from this is, in the case of Mexico, we really have a binational community.
Y así hay que asumirlo, y creo que eso no debe constituir un motivo de conflicto.
Yeah, and you have to sort of take this into account, and it shouldn't be a reason for conflict.
En mi caso particular,
In my own case,
mi madre nació en Portugal,
my mother was Portuguese,
emigró a México,
migrated to Mexico,
conserva muchos aspectos de la cultura portuguesa, pero es totalmente mexicana al mismo tiempo.
She kept a lot of aspects of Portuguese culture, but she's completely Mexican.
Mi esposa es cubana,
My wife's Cuban.
Mi hijo es hijo de mexicano y cubana y estudia en los Estados Unidos en este momento.
My son's Cuban, Mexican, and he's studying in the United States.
Y creo que es perfectamente posible entender, comprender y asimilar aspectos de una cultura diferente al tiempo que se conservan los propios.
And I think it's really possible to understand and take on some of the characteristics of one culture without necessarily losing your own culture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would also like to refer briefly to this assimilation question because I am very interested in that. Oh, I think I don't have this.
No, it's just for the tape. It's not
Oh, just for the tape. Oh,
Talk
okay.
louder. They can't hear you in the back.
Oh, okay.
Stand up.
Well, I'll speak louder. So I hear when we were listening to Doug Massey's presentation, there is a lot of fear, and there is a lot of fear in the media, there is a lot of fear in the public, that Latinos are not assimilating, and like to mention, like for instance, Samuel Huntington arguments that they are not becoming into this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture because they have different values, they tend to be Catholic, they're more likely to be Catholic, but you know, there is not even sound research that can prove that this is the case. And we now know, little by little, a lot more about Latin American immigrants. And one thing that recently fascinates me is the high level of conversions. And one of the most important religions that is taking the lead for taking all these Catholics that have been defecting from Catholicism is the Pentecostals. In Chicago, especially in Chicago metro area, there is a great wave of Pentecostals, and those are Pentecostals that are affiliated to the traditional American Pentecostal church founded in the early 1900s. There is no more American than that. So, and we also know that by the third generation, like Latinos, are more likely to be Protestant or evangelical in any denominations. So they are not, by the third generation, they are not persistent in their Catholicism. And also, we know that by the third generation, they are mostly monolingual. And the ones that are still a little bit behind, by the fifth generation, I can guarantee you that anyone that is Latino will be very unlikely that he or she will speak Spanish at all. So this idea that they do not assimilate, that they do not learn English, this is something that is pretty much preached on not sound research. It's more on a nativism that wants to keep America with the mainstream that has a lot to do with this romantic idea of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, and they want to keep it like that. But this is not the case with like the immigrants. And for my own research, let me share with you something. For a decade, many of my colleagues, we and I, have been trying to find how the second generation is, the U.S.-born children of immigrants, how they are engaging in these 3-for-1 matching fund projects, funding projects, transnationalism, and all of that. And we have yet to find a stable group of second-generation youth who happens to be engaged at the same rate as their fathers are in transnationalism and in matching fund projects, in 3x1, in community development, in communities of origin. They are very much engaged with their new communities. They care about education, they care about the DREAM Act, they care about voting, they care about discrimination, rights in the workplace, and many other agendas. But they are not as interested as their parents are in these transnational issues, which tells us that for us, that we are very much fascinated in understanding these phenomena, we sometimes have difficulty claiming that this is very widespread, because there are no numbers that can hold that this is like a trend, that everyone is going to be transnational in the future and that they are not going to assimilate into the American culture. This is not the case. So I would love to find a group of youth that is doing a project in the Xóchitl del Canje for more than a decade, but I haven't found it. And my colleagues working in New York and in California share the same results, that the second generation is not engaging at the same level, at least for transnational issues that had to do with migration and development.
There were two other questions on the floor, too.
What was the second question? I forgot.
Fred, you were...
Regaining the rhetorical high ground.
Oh, regaining the rhetorical high ground. Well, the best I can say there is I miss Senator Kennedy a lot. There's a remarkable lack of political leadership and political courage in Washington to stand up against the nativist xenophobic claque that is dominating the airwaves right now. They live in fear of what is really a minority of people. And people are afraid to stick their neck out, afraid to speak out. Even people who support immigration reform, the authors of the new round of immigration reform, like Charles Schumer of New York, and you can't be anti-immigrant and be a politician in New York City. His mantra is, the border is the front line of the war on terror. We need to gain control of the border, as if we ever lost control of the border. We need to increase border enforcement. This is part of the immigration reform mantra. You can't do immigration reform without spending more money on border enforcement. As if the Mexico-U.S. border was somehow responsible for 9/11. And no one has the cojones to stand up and say that this is all a lot of idiocy and it's all a lie. Somebody, I do it, but I don't have a TV show every night. And I have a pretty big platform. I'm much bigger than a private citizen. I'm a professor at Princeton, but among politicians and political leaders, from President Obama on down, there is a lack of political courage to stand up and call these racist pigs for what they fucking are. And there's a terrible anti-black, anti-Latino, racist, xenophobic reaction going on in the United States that's careening more and more out of control, and I think is tending more and more towards violence. So far, the authorities have been able to break up some of these militias and stop their plots, but sooner or later, one of them is going to hit, and people are encouraging it through their silence. It reminds me of Weimar Germany in the late 1920s. No one is standing up to it. How do you regain the high ground? You get up and somebody has to get up and plant a flag on the high ground and defend it. And somebody prominent. That's something I expected of Obama, and I've been disappointed not to see it. The mistake in the 1980s about when Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, and there were 3.2 million legalizations in the United States. Of course, there were a lot of big mistakes made, one of which was they didn't change anything else about immigration policy, and the same conditions that produced the buildup of undocumented migrants to that point remained in force. And in fact, we toughened anti-immigrant enforcement rather than creating legal channels for people to come in. And then we exacerbated the problem by negotiating a free trade agreement with Mexico so that we create a North American economy with free movement of goods, capital, information across borders, massive increase in traffic of all kinds across the border, massive increase in Americans going to Mexico, massive increase in Mexicans coming to the United States as tourists, exchange visitors, as investors, and we make no provision whatsoever for the movement of labor. In fact, we argue against all logic that somehow the North American Free Trade Agreement is going to prevent the movement of labor. We had a golden opportunity in 1994 to put in motion a process that would have solved the problems and would have obviated the immigration crisis that we see now. In 1994, if the United States and Canada had treated Mexico the same way that the countries of Northern Europe treated Spain and Portugal when they brought them into the European Union in the mid-1980s, we wouldn't be in this fix now. When the European Union debated about bringing Spain and Portugal in, they were debating about bringing in very poor countries, very backward economies, former fascist dictatorships with high rates of fertility that had been sending migrants out for millennia. But it was more than a simple predatory agreement, as NAFTA was, where the United States sought to get everything it could out of Mexico without giving up anything in return. It was a broader political and economic vision. Some kind of grudgingly admitting Spain and Portugal into the European Union. They admitted them as full members. Instead of building a wall along the Pyrenees to keep the Spaniards out of Europe and spending billions of dollars or euros or marks in doing that, they spent those billions of dollars in structural adjustment funds, knowing that to integrate Spain into more advanced countries in Europe was going to be very disruptive in Spain and require a lot of investments in infrastructure, a lot of infrastructural improvements, a lot of governance improvements. That was the price that Spain had to pay to get into the European Union, make those reforms at home, and then the Europeans actually helped them cover the ground they needed to cover with 10 to 15 years of structural adjustment funds. If the United States had spent even a fraction of the billions and billions of dollars we've spent in useless border enforcement, worse than useless, counterproductive border enforcement, on structural adjustment funds to improve basic infrastructure, basic systems of governance, basic institutions in Mexico, we wouldn't have this problem today. And Mexico would be integrated into a North American economy as a much more prosperous place, and migration between the two countries would have been a fraction of what it turned out to be. When Spain finally got full labor mobility into the European Union, rather than spurring out migration, there was a massive return of Spaniards back to Europe. Moreover, there was a massive surge of Northern Europeans into Spain, so that some towns in Spain on the coast and the Balearic Islands have German mayors now. And it's very much a two-way street. In North America, there are about 7 million Mexicans in the United States, no, about 10 million Mexicans in the United States, 10 or 11 million Mexicans in the United States, but there are also 1 million Americans living in Mexico, and the number of Americans living in Mexico is growing quite rapidly. It's a two-way street, and I would say that if anything, the Mexicans are much more prepared and much more willing to deal with the realities of North American integration than the United States is. If you take a random Mexican, draw them out of a hat in Mexico, they're much more likely to speak English than a random Anglo-American is likely to speak Spanish in this country. Because English is the international language of commerce and business, it's a very prized commodity even in Mexico. You go to the smallest little towns, you'll find English language academies. Mexicans learn English, they learn English in the United States, they learn English in Mexico. Mexico passes a law allowing for dual nationality. Meanwhile, we build fences, we set up conceptual barriers, we demonize, we racialize Mexicans as these terrible, menacing, threatening others. We move in precisely the opposite direction.
What I want to do, it might be a little frustrating for some people in the audience, though, is to end the formal questions now, because I see a lot of people are starting to leave, and I hate when a program that's been packed and enthusiastic sort of dissolves by attrition. So I know that all of our guests this evening will stick around for a few minutes to talk to people who were frustrated at not being able to ask their question in front of the group. And I want to thank Professor Xóchitl Bada, Governor Lázaro Cárdenas, Artemio Arreola, Professor Douglas Massey,